Welcome to Back to the Text Themselves, a series on phenomenology. Today we examine Part 2, Section 5 of the Intro to Being and Time. In this video, I'll address the following questions. 1. What is a world? 2. What is Dasein's everydayness? And 3. What is time? If you learned something from this video and want to support this work, please consider liking it, sharing it, and subscribing to my channel. So let's take up our first question. What is a world? Now, formulating the question of the meaning of being requires considering Dasein. And as such, it's necessary that Dasein be adequately understood and to know how to understand it. Though Dasein has an ontic ontological priority, this doesn't necessitate that the meaning of Dasein is immediately available to us, that it's accessible without any kind of interpretation. Dasein is what is nearest to us, since it is us, but because it is so close, it's also the hardest to see. As Heidegger states, Dasein is ontically close, but ontologically far removed. What does this mean? Ontically, it means that Dasein is part of our everyday existence with its distinct set of possibilities that I'm constantly encountering. However, it's effortless to become absorbed in what we might call the daily grind of assuming and neglecting our possibilities. For this reason, we can't see those general structures of our existence. This makes Dasein ontically far removed, meaning far removed from how we understand ourselves. Dasein has an intuitive understanding of its being, but it's one informed by the beings of the world. The term world here has several meanings in being and time. In the present context, world is placed in quotes. When this is done throughout the text, it refers to an ontic dimension as what is objectively present in the world, the totality of beings available to us. In discussing the concept of world, it might be helpful here to at least mention the other senses. When used without quotes, world refers to the place in which one factually lives, which is another ontic meaning. But when world is deployed in the word worldliness, we have now crossed over to the ontological sense. Worldliness refers to the way a being is a being in the world. In other words, it's a structural dimension of Dasein's existence. So now we can understand a little better what Heidegger means in this context when he says that Dasein tends to understand its own being in terms of that being to which it is essentially, continuously, and most closely related, the world. What this means is that Dasein typically understands itself based on what is objectively present to it. It defines itself in terms of other beings. Perhaps the most predominant form of this is the scientific worldview. We come to define ourselves as a collection of atoms, cells, nervous tissue, or whatever is fashionable in science these days. Heidegger lists some other possible interpretations, from biography to anthropology to history. Each of these forms of knowledge takes up a particular understanding of Dasein. However, these are all existential analyses that address the ontic dimension. They're not existential analyses that address the ontological dimension. How would we then go about examining the ontological dimension? This leads us to the second question: what is everydayness? Heidegger suggests that an existential analysis should reveal Dasein to itself on its own terms and in its average everydayness. Now, this is at first surprising. We just got done saying that we must not limit ourselves to the ontic analyses. So how does the average everydayness of Dasein function as a dimension of the ontological analysis? Let us recall that the term world concerns how Dasein understands itself through other beings in the world. Everydayness concerns how Dasein is immersed in that world, in the manner of being absorbed and taken up by the crowd. It will be what Heidegger will later call an inauthentic mode of being. The critical distinction is that whereas Dasein ordinarily understands itself in terms of the beings in the world, to understand Dasein's everydayness requires a level of abstraction that takes Dasein out of its absorption with that world. So paradoxically, to be aware of one's everydayness is already to step outside of it to some degree. I want to pause here for a moment and identify a trend that has been emerging so far. When considering the meaning of being, we're led to conclude that we must analyze a particular being, Dasein. Now, as we're considering the existence of Dasein, we're led to the conclusion that it is in the mundane dimension of Dasein's everydayness that will provide the path. We can see here how Heidegger is working against a trend in philosophy to begin in abstraction. He is not dealing in Platonic forms, nor in a priori categories of understanding, nor in some transcendental ego to address the question of being in general. Instead, he moves us toward particularity, toward the concreteness of existence, in order to arrive at what is an abstract concept, perhaps the most abstract concept of all, that of being. So in analyzing Dasein's everydayness, what light does it shed upon the meaning of being, or at least the meaning of Dasein's being? This leads us to the third question today: what is time? The analysis of Dasein's everydayness brings out the horizon that will serve as the basis for the most primordial, the most elemental interpretation of being. That horizon is Dasein's temporality, and it will be from an analysis of the temporality of Dasein that will prepare the way for considering the meaning of being in general. Now, a question that might come up is why time rather than something else like space as the horizon for understanding? In a sense, we have only spoken of spatiality so far when discussing Dasein. Recall that that word means being there or being here, a being in the world. Dasein is the designation of a particular spatiality that Heidegger suggests must be understood in view of time. Let's note that there's another crucial move here. Space and time are fundamental philosophical concepts. Immanuel Kant considered them to be the two basic categories of the mental faculty of sensibility. Through these categories, the sensibility generates the primary form of our intuitions. Those intuitions then serve as the foundation for judgments that will subsequently be made through the faculty of the understanding. Kant's remarkable contribution was to dislocate time and space from external reality and make them part of the mind. However, this gives rise to the famous split between the knowable part of reality, the phenomena, and what is fundamentally unknowable, the things in themselves, before and beyond mental faculty processing, or what is also called the noumena. One of the critical contributions of Husserl was to overcome this divide created by Kant between the phenomena and the noumena by framing phenomenology as a return back to the things themselves. In other words, the appearance and the thing that appears are brought back together after being split apart in Kant's philosophy. Now, Heidegger is radicalizing Husserl by reformulating time and space. Rather than situating them within subjectivity, which we could interpret Husserl as continuing to do, they serve as the coordinates whereby subjectivity, for lack of a better word at the moment, may emerge. Time is the horizon by which Dasein can understand and interpret its being, and indeed is the horizon for understanding every being. The term horizon here has a specific meaning. It was deployed by Husserl and is analogous to how we might think of literal horizons. Horizons provide the range and limits of what one can see. Those horizons shift depending upon where one is standing. Rather than merely a spatial concept, however, horizons can be temporal, historical, cultural, etc. Husserl first addresses the concept of horizons in Ideas 1. He identifies the world as a horizon of all horizons, a collective horizon of possible investigations. A phenomenological analysis of objects, hence, is never in isolation, but happens in light of a background context or surrounding world of other objects and situations. Heidegger takes up this notion and identifies time as the most fundamental horizon. Within this horizon, the possibilities of the world, including all of its horizons, may be actualized. As we ordinarily think of it, the common conception of time is derivative of this more fundamental form of time. Interestingly, Heidegger identifies that familiar way of understanding time in terms of space. How so? Well, if we think about it, what is the way we keep track of time? Of course, we could say a clock, but this is a measurement of time. So it's even a further step removed from the most fundamental understanding. What exactly is being measured? It's change and movement, the sequence of actions and events. When I think about my history, I consider where I've been, how I acted, who I was in relationship with. These are all spatial categories organized sequentially, and as such, ordinary time is defined spatially. Heidegger argues that there is a more fundamental conception of time than this. He next offers a glimpse into the history of the concept of time. Despite time being a well-rehearsed concept in the history of thought, he argues that it's yet to be adequately reflected upon as a theme in considering how time has a distinctive ontological role. And this is what Heidegger sets out to do, to show how ontology is rooted in the phenomenon of time. Consequently, Heidegger declares that its temporal determination primarily establishes the meaning of being. The task of fundamental ontology, then, will be the interpretation of being in light of its temporality. Here we'll first arrive at an initial concrete answer to the question of the meaning of being. Being is understandable only in terms of time. Consequently, the truth of being will not be a timeless proposition, as has been the case throughout the history of philosophy. And with that, we'll end today's video. In the following video, we'll continue examining part 2 of the introduction to being and time. Thank you for watching. Until next time, be well.